This week, a single stock chart wiped out months of gains in a matter of days. Chip stocks that had climbed for a year fell more than 13% in a single week. Somewhere in that stretch, a trader watched their portfolio drop and felt something far sharper than they felt on the way up. Not just disappointment, something closer to pain. Here's the strange part. That trader didn't lose more money than they'd gained over the past year. In plenty of cases, they were still ahead. But it didn't feel that way. It felt like a wound. And there's a reason for that, one that has almost nothing to do with the actual numbers on the screen. Losses and gains of the exact same size are not treated equally by your brain. Not even close. Losing $100 doesn't feel like the opposite of gaining $100. It feels worse, significantly worse. And once you understand why, you start to see this pattern everywhere, not just in stock charts, but in almost every decision you make involving something you could lose. Psychologist Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky first put a number on this back in 1979 in a paper that would eventually help win Kahneman a Nobel Prize. They called it prospect theory, and one of its central findings became known as loss aversion. Their research found that losses are felt, on average, about twice as intensely as equivalent gains. Not slightly more intensely, roughly double. Lose $100 and the emotional hit is about the same as the emotional lift you'd need from gaining $200 just to feel even again. Your brain isn't running a simple, symmetrical ledger where up and down cancel each other out. It's running something closer to a warped scale, one where the losing side of the scale is weighted almost twice as heavy. Think about what that means for a moment. It means a fair coin flip, win $100 or lose $100, isn't actually a neutral bet in your head. Even though the math is perfectly even, most people will turn it down. Not because they can't do the arithmetic, because the potential loss looms larger in their mind than the potential gain, even when both are mathematically identical. Kahneman and Tversky ran this exact experiment, offering people fair bets with even odds, and found that most people needed the potential gain to be roughly twice the potential loss before they'd even consider taking the bet. Win 200, lose 100, even odds. Now it starts to feel worth the risk. That number, that rough 2-to-1 ratio, has shown up again and again in decades of follow-up research since. It's worth pausing on how strange this is once you say it plainly. You are, in a very literal sense, walking around with an internal exchange rate. $1 of loss doesn't trade evenly against $1 of gain inside your head. It trades against roughly $2 of gain. That exchange rate isn't written down anywhere, and most people have never consciously calculated it, but it shows up reliably in how they behave. Whether they're deciding on a coin flip in a lab, a stock to sell, or a risk to take at work. The rate isn't fixed at exactly 2-to-1 for every person in every situation, but the direction of the asymmetry, losses weighing heavier than equivalent gains, shows up with remarkable consistency across cultures, income levels, and decades of replication. So where does this asymmetry actually come from? It isn't a flaw. It isn't your brain malfunctioning. It's a decision-making rule that made enormous sense in a very different environment than the one you're in now. Picture an environment where resources were scarce and unpredictable, where a single bad season, a single failed hunt, a single lost store of food could be the difference between survival and starvation. In that world, a loss wasn't just a setback you'd recover from next quarter. A loss could be catastrophic and permanent. There was no safety net, no emergency fund, no insurance policy. If your food store was destroyed or stolen or spoiled, you didn't just feel disappointed. You were now closer to the edge of survival than you were an hour ago. Gains, meanwhile, while certainly welcome, rarely carried that same life or death weight. An extra good hunt was wonderful, but it didn't usually determine whether you lived through the winter the way a catastrophic loss could. In an environment like that, a brain that weighted losses more heavily than gains wasn't being irrational. It was being appropriately cautious. Treating losses and gains as equally important would have been the actual mistake, because losses genuinely carried more existential weight than equivalent gains did. Evolution doesn't optimize for mathematical elegance. It optimizes for survival. And a decision-making system that flinches harder from potential losses than it reaches toward potential gains is exactly the kind of system that keeps an organism alive through unpredictable scarcity, generation after generation. There's a useful way to picture just how lopsided the actual stakes were. Imagine two versions of an ancestor facing the same string of 10 seasons, 5 good and 5 bad. One version weighs gains and losses equally, celebrating the good seasons exactly as much as they mourn the bad ones, and treating the string of seasons as a wash. The other version, the one-loss aversion would produce, feels each bad season roughly twice as intensely as each good one, and as a result becomes noticeably more cautious after every setback, hoarding more, taking fewer risks, staying closer to known, reliable food sources. Over enough repeated cycles of scarcity, the second version survives more winters. Not because the emotional math is fair, because the emotional math is tuned to a world where a single truly catastrophic loss, the kind that doesn't average out over 10 seasons, because there's no 11th season to recover in, was always a live possibility. The asymmetry isn't a bug in the reasoning, it's insurance against the one kind of loss that a fair symmetrical brain would have badly underweighted. The problem is that this same ancient weighting system is still running, unmodified, inside a brain that now has to navigate index funds, quarterly earnings reports, and stock tickers that update every second. Modern financial markets are, in a sense, a kind of environment your loss aversion instinct was never built to interpret correctly. A 10% drop in your portfolio during a market downturn doesn't threaten your physical survival the way a lost food store once did, but your brain doesn't fully know that. It processes that red number using roughly the same ancient weighting system that once kept your ancestors cautious around genuinely existential risks. This is where researcher Terrance Odean's work becomes useful. Odean studied thousands of real trading accounts and found a very specific, very costly pattern, now known as the disposition effect. Investors, he found, are significantly more likely to sell stocks that have gone up in value than stocks that have gone down. In other words, people tend to lock in their winners quickly and hold on to their losers far longer than the underlying fundamentals would justify. On the surface, that looks backwards. You'd expect people to cut their losses and let their winners run. Instead, Odean's data showed the opposite tendency, again and again, across real accounts with real money. Loss aversion explains why. Selling a losing stock forces you to convert a loss that currently only exists on paper into a real, finalized, undeniable loss. As long as you keep holding it, there's still a story you can tell yourself where the stock recovers and the loss never really happened. Selling locks that story shut because losses feel roughly twice as painful as equivalent gains. The mind will go to surprising lengths to avoid finalizing one, even when holding on is the objectively worst financial decision. Selling a winner, meanwhile, carries none of that same threat. Locking in a gain feels safe, almost protective, even when the math might actually favor holding longer. The asymmetry in how losses and gains feel translates directly into an asymmetry in what people actually do with their money. There's a broader pattern that economist Robert Shiller spent much of his career studying, one that scales this individual bias up to the level of entire markets. Shiller's research on what he called irrational exuberance showed that markets don't just reflect calm, rational pricing based on fundamentals. They reflect waves of collective emotion moving through large groups of people at roughly the same time. And loss aversion plays a central role in how those waves form. When a market starts falling and enough individual investors start feeling that sharper doubled pain of realized or anticipated losses, the resulting wave of selling can become self-reinforcing. One person's fear-driven sale becomes the next person's falling price, which becomes the next person's reason to feel the same fear. Shiller's work suggests that a market crash isn't just an aggregation of individually rational decisions. It's often a chain reaction of a very old, very human asymmetry playing out simultaneously across thousands of people who have never met each other. This also explains something else about the semiconductor sell-off mentioned at the start of this video. It isn't only about chip stocks or artificial intelligence spending or any of the specific headlines driving that particular week. Every real market movement has real causes behind it, actual news, actual earnings, actual shifts in the underlying business. But once those real causes trigger the first wave of losses, loss aversion takes over as an accelerant. The pain of the first 10% drop pushes some investors to sell, which deepens the drop, which sharpens the pain for everyone still holding, which pushes more people to sell. The underlying story and the psychological amplifier work together, but they aren't the same thing, and untangling them is most of what separates a calm, rational read on a downturn from a panic-driven one. So what actually helps here, if the goal is making better decisions inside a brain that's still running this ancient weighting system? Researchers who've studied loss aversion in financial contexts have found that reframing the decision in terms of a portfolio as a whole, rather than individual line items, measurably reduces the grip of this bias. Looking at one stock that's dropped 10% triggers a sharp, isolated loss signal. Looking at your entire portfolio's performance over a full year, where gains and losses are naturally blended together, triggers a much weaker version of the same signal, even when the underlying numbers haven't changed at all. This isn't a trick to fool yourself. It's closer to giving your ancient loss detection system a wider, more accurate picture to react to, instead of the narrowest, most emotionally loaded slice of it. There's also something worth remembering about the 2-to-1 ratio itself. Once you know that your brain requires a potential gain to be roughly double a potential loss before it feels emotionally worth the risk, you can start to notice when that instinct is quietly overriding a decision that the actual numbers don't support. A 10% portfolio drop that still leaves you well ahead over 5 years isn't actually the crisis it feels like in the moment. Knowing that the feeling is running about twice as loud as the math justifies doesn't make the feeling disappear, but it does give you a number to check the feeling against. The same way knowing a scale is calibrated wrong doesn't stop you from stepping on it, but does stop you from trusting the reading without adjustment. Now, some financial researchers building on this work have also pointed to how often the checking itself is the problem. Every time you check a portfolio, you expose yourself to a fresh chance of seeing a loss, however small or temporary, and each of those small exposures carries its own dose of the doubled emotional weight, even when the long-term trend is solidly positive. Someone who checks their investments once a year experiences far fewer individual, loss-triggering moments than someone who checks daily, even if both end the year with the exact same return. The frequency of looking, not just the size of the swings, shapes how painful an ordinary, healthy market behaves like inside a mind wired this way. Kahneman himself, later in his career, pointed out something worth sitting with. Loss aversion isn't a bug that shows up occasionally in unusual circumstances. It shows up constantly in decisions far smaller than a stock portfolio, in negotiations, in relationships, in whether you're willing to try something new that might not work out. The same ancient weighting system that makes a 10% market drop feel catastrophic is quietly shaping thousands of smaller decisions every week. Almost all of them too minor to notice individually, but adding up to a consistent lifelong tilt away from risk, even in situations where the actual odds favor taking it. So the next time a red number on a screen sends a jolt through your chest that feels wildly out of proportion to the actual dollar amount involved, it might help to remember what's underneath that feeling. It isn't poor judgment, and it isn't a personal failure to stay calm. It's a scale that's been weighted the same way for a very long time, built for a world where a single bad season could end everything, still doing its job, in a world of index funds and quarterly earnings, where the actual stakes of most single losses are nowhere near as high as that ancient scale still insists they are.